So in a 2017 book entitled The Future of War, A History, Sir Lawrence Friedman identifies three distinct periods of history in the 20th century in terms of conflict. The first period he identified is the Great Power Conflict, in which the militaries of the great powers focused on attaining decisive victories to end wars as quickly as possible. This included the First and Second World Wars and lasted until the end of the Cold War. What followed has been defined by various terms such as the unipolar moment or maybe the Pax Americana, but all of them suggested that the period of peace and prosperity was coming. However, the rising prevalence of irregular wars indicated that this was not to be the case. In a series of conflicts from Africa to the Balkans and to the Middle East, Western militaries found that not only was it not a peaceful time, but the decisive battles were no longer consistently producing the desired national security outcomes that they had come to expect. By the 21st century, many strategists had attempted to rethink strategy for an age of so-called new wars that required less kinetic force and more nuanced strategies. Yet just as militaries were refocusing on irregular warfare, a shift to the third period occurred that involves the renewed possibility for great power conflict. And that's the period that we're in right now. The rise of China, the resurgence of Russian power and aggressiveness, along with other states like Iran and North Korea, indicate that great power wars are a possibility that Western militaries can no longer ignore. So how to prepare for big wars while still possessing the right strategies for small irregular wars has become a central challenge for the American military and for American national defense. Now, this is conveyed in today's parlance by the mnemonic 2+3. And this is embedded in the National Defense Strategy, and this prescribes the priority challenges worthy of U.S. attention. The two are Russia and China, and the three are North Korea, Iran, and violent extremism. The fact that the U.S. and its partners have to strike this incredibly delicate balance amid an ongoing information revolution in which technology is increasing lethality and the prominence of space and cyberspace domains makes this an even greater challenge. So all this sets up the premise here. Gideon Rose is one of many people who have addressed this situation. Now, Gideon Rose is well qualified to do so. He's a member of the Council on Foreign Relations. He's been the editor of Foreign Affairs since 2010. He studied classics at Yale, got a PhD in government from Harvard, and he's also taught foreign policy at Princeton and at Columbia's prestigious School of International and Public Affairs. So this guy is an informed citizen. He knows what he's talking about. And he wrote in 2010, he wrote this book here, How War Ends. Sorry, it's backwards, but wanted to hold up there for you. And his book, How Wars Ends, he presents a history of American intervention from World War II to Afghanistan to investigate the periods outlined by Friedman in an effort to discover why the U.S. always seems to fight the last battle of the previous war whenever it engages in a new conflict. Reviewing the major conflicts America has fought since World War I, Rose identifies a consistent pattern that emerges and which forms the basis of his answer: that American leaders focus too much on defeating the enemy and too little on creating a stable post-war environment and sustainable political outcome. By ignoring the need for careful and deliberate post-war planning, America consistently disregards the political aspect of war, resulting in an unsatisfactory outcome and the need to refight conflicts over again to resolve them. Now, while George Washington, U.S. Grant, George Marshall, and Dwight Eisenhower are some examples of Americans who understood this idea and acted accordingly, it is important to understand that this is very difficult to do. According to Rose, this occurrence is also not unique to America, and it is in fact the norm for most nation-state actors and non-state actors, because this dilemma is actually an inherent part of and at the very heart of the dual face nature of war. characterized by its destructive nature on one hand and its constructive capabilities on the other. The Clausewitzian challenge, according to Rose, is then this: how do you reconcile war's destructive capability with its constructive potential to make force serve politics? That's the Clausewitzian challenge that he lays out. Author and historian Thomas Fleming captured the essence of this conundrum nicely, highlighting war's destructive and constructive nature in a following quotation from his novel Over There. Fleming said, "Intelligent violence wins wars, and wars are the engine of history." Now, he was being a bit tongue-in-cheek and a bit polemic, but it's a great quote nonetheless. Now, Rose's interpretation here is nothing new. This was one of the main implied conclusions from the 1986 American book, America's First Battles. And in addition, historian D. Clayton James made a similar case in his outstanding 1993 book, Refighting the Last War, Command and Crisis in Korea. James argued that since the Korean War, the American template has been basically to proceed into each new conflict largely by simply applying the lessons of the last war to the new context, regardless of whether they are appropriate for the new situation. What is new about Rose's approach is the way he incorporates military theory into his investigation by bringing in the ideas of Clausewitz into the discussion. Now, I'm a big-time Clausewitz guy, so let me walk us through just a little bit of Clausewitz so we can understand this. And he thinks about it in these terms. In terms of the tactical and operational levels of war, Clausewitz defined war as an act of force to compel our enemy to do our will. This addresses the destructive capabilities of war to use battles and campaigns to achieve desired ends on the battlefield. In terms of the strategic and political levels, Clausewitz also defined war as an act of policy, a continuation of political intercourse carried on with other means. And I'm quoting that from the Howard and Perret version on there, which is the one that's mostly used. This addresses the constructive capabilities of war to make the best use of military means to achieve desired political ends while accounting for risk and in ways that are feasible, acceptable, and suitable. So the old FAST test. Now, I find that addressing war's destructive capabilities in terms of tactics and operations and war's constructive capabilities in terms of strategy and policy to be both useful and effective. And it can also help us connect the ideas of some of the authors I've mentioned to help us make sense of Rose's plan. Now, there are a couple of reasons why this dynamic continues to occur and is so challenging to overcome. The first is that the way a war is fought shapes the peace that follows. Clausewitz says that the main lines of war are political, and they continue from the war into the post-war strategy. This means that what you do during the war has a discernible and dramatic effect on the post-war environment. The post-World War I Versailles settlement is a great example of this. World War I was fought ferociously on both sides, making it quite difficult for any of the major belligerents to accept a settlement that was something less than what they felt they deserved and had in fact paid for in blood. However, this kind of thinking infected the peace negotiations, and the resulting Treaty of Versailles was overly punitive to the Germans and did little to ultimately resolve the security dilemmas in Europe, resulting in round two being fought 20 years later at a tremendously greater cost. A good settlement in the war is one that leaves all the powerful parties satisfied with the outcome and no unsatisfied parties particularly powerful. Versailles was, in fact, the complete opposite of that. Another reason for this continued dynamic is highlighted exceptionally well in Cathal Nolan's recent 2017 book, The Allure of Battle, a history of how wars have been fought and lost. This is a great book if you haven't read it. It's thick, but boy, it is a good one. I'm telling you what, he really lays it out. Nolan addresses the overwhelming appeal of battle as the preferred method of many leaders and nations to resolve their political disputes that has existed in the West from the Middle Ages through World War II, targeting the chimera of decisive battle, which he really dismisses. Nolan cogently explains that the folly of short-term thinking associated with tactics and operations to win battles, as compared to the longer views of strategy and policy that have been most responsible for bringing victory, but all but a few nations represent the exception rather than the rule during this period. In fact, historian Victor Davis Hanson has identified the quest for decisive battle as being so overwhelming that he calls it, or he attributes it as one of the defining attributes of the Western way of war, going all the way back to antiquity and the Greeks. So we've got this impact of how you fight the war on there, and we've also got this allure of battle that I can solve this in one big climactic battle out there, one Waterloo, one Konigratz, one Gaugamela, one battle, and it's going to solve it all. And in fact, it just doesn't happen very often. And I'll say a little more about that in a bit. British General Rupert Smith addressed both of these reasons quite thoughtfully in his 2005 book, The Utility of Force. Another great one, another great book. Rupert Smith is quite a thinker. He subtitled it The Art of War in the Modern World. And in this book, Smith argued that force is no longer able to achieve the outcomes of which it was previously capable, highlighting what I had said before. And he says that the reason for this is because the objective of modern conflict has changed. It used to be, in the pre-modern war period, and he's talking Cold War and before, that breaking the will of the enemy to resist was the way that you won the clash of wills. But now, Smith says that in the modern era, in the post-Cold War era, capturing the will of the opponent is the only viable way to resolve conflict under the threat of nuclear arms and the wanton destruction available to modern terrorists. In addition, and since, as Smith contends, modern warfare occurs amongst the people, that's what he calls it now, warfare amongst the people, it is conducted primarily at the tactical and the operational levels, which have experienced a tremendous increase in lethality since the mid-19th century, but decreasing decisiveness, since actions at these levels can no longer bring about the end of a conflict in a single climactic decisive battle or campaign. And they are also not nearly as effective at changing beliefs and desires as are the actions at the strategic and the political levels. As a result, Smith argues, force can no longer be used to decide the political dispute, but instead to simply create the conditions in which a strategic and political result can be achieved. This point has been made previously by other authors, reflecting the very different structure of smaller wars. The authors of the Marine Corps Small Wars Manual wrote in 1940 that the systemic political and economic reforms are far more likely to be effective in countering an insurgency than any battlefield victory, meaning that the military dimension is often and rightly overshadowed by political, social, economic, and psychological concerns. In fact, the authors wrote that the military strategy of such conflicts is more directly associated with the political and strategic aims of the campaign than it is in the case of modern operations or in major operations, because these smaller wars, unlike their major operation counterparts, they likely occur when, quote, either diplomacy has not been exhausted or the party that opposes the settlement of the political question cannot even be reached diplomatically, end quote, and are thus taking place concurrently with diplomatic efforts. This highlights the imperative for tighter integration at all aspects of national power, especially at the strategic and the political levels. In addition, the approach to the use of force in small wars is quite different from its application in major war, prioritizing caution and steadiness to accomplish the purpose by diplomacy instead of promoting this belligerent spirit when employing force. All of this has combined to both highlight and exacerbate the Clausewitz challenge identified by Rose, which stated succinctly as this: how do you reconcile war's destructive power with its constructive power to overcome short-term thinking and make force serve policy? That's a great question, and he's posed it well. I'll use a couple of examples from history to illustrate when this was done well and when this was not done well, to kind of, spice this up or kind of seed our discussion here. And then hopefully I'll wrap it up a little bit and then get some input from you guys. So let's go way back to antiquity then. Alexander the Great. When he was alive, man, he was good. So let's look at him in those two things. He did fight brutally, much more brutally, but he used battles to destroy the Persian Empire. But then he co-opted the conquered people into the empire, and he increased his available resources to be able to control his increased territory. This is fantastic strategy. This is exactly what Rose said we should do. Use the destructive power to set the conditions, and then use the constructive power to then achieve the desired ends. Of course, in Alexander's case, he never did, because enough was never enough. Now, he was also terrible after death, too, because on his deathbed, they said, who should succeed you? And he reportedly croaked the strongest, setting off a huge fight among his generals, three of which really, kind of fractured his empire, Ptolemy being one of them. Okay, so that's Alexander the Great. Good example there. The nation of arms concept, the levée en masse, and then the industrialization during the Industrial Revolution kind of transformed the balance away from the destructive abilities to achieve constructive success, because a nation now could continue to recruit and field armies. No more decisive battles, no more great captains to resolve the issues in a single battle or campaign. In fact, the argument out there is that Napoleon was the last. You could maybe make a case for Moltke or Grant, but boy, when you get in the 20th century, you got nothing. So let's say Napoleon, the greatest of the great captains, comes on the scene. He's only so-so, but in contrast to Alexander the Great, the destruction of war definitely overshadowed the construction. Napoleon did build an empire, and he did control more of the European landmass than anybody, but it got worse as time went on. As the destruction overwhelmed the construction and his rule and his leadership became coercive, he really didn't co-opt the conquered people into the empire. He coerced them in. He made them do it. And so that he did not really increase the available resources to be able to increase that territory. So that by certainly 1914, the Allies were able to field better and larger armies to defeat and depose him not once, but twice, with Waterloo being the final showdown. Let's stay in Europe and keep going forward. Prussia is fantastic under Bismarck. Now, Bismarck kept Moltke under control to use the destructive power of war to win battles, to unite Germany and form the German Empire. This was fantastic. And they had enough resources and resolve to control the territory. However, when Moltke leaves, things get bad for the Germans. So, when Bismarck leaves, the Germans, they were terrible. They consistently tried to really achieve these unrealistic strategic and political goals using tactical and operational brilliance. They fought in such a way as they upset people greatly, and they never had the resources to control the territory. Certainly not in World War I. And in World War II, the Nazis were so deluded on this. They were actually convinced that they could mobilize fewer Germans and control even more territory. So the Germans really are a great example of how terrible this is. However, not to be outdone, the Japanese in World War II were just as bad. They consistently tried to achieve strategic and political goals via tactical and operational brilliance, and they fought well, but boy, did they fight in a way that just ensured no one was going to join their coalition, and that the peace, it was going to have to be an unconditional surrender because there was going to be no peace. They never, in addition, they never had the resources to control the Greater East Asian co-prosperity sphere. That was never going to happen. It was always beyond their reach. Using an operational example, we'll look at Korea. MacArthur's Incheon landing was brilliant operationally. It absolutely managed the breakout from the 8th Army in the Pusan perimeter to link up, but it was catastrophically disastrous at the strategic and political level. It transformed the balance of resources against the UN by bringing in the Chinese communists, and it made victory largely unattainable. Whereas if the Incheon landing had just been focused on securing a free and independent non-communist Republic of South Korea, fantastic, it would have been it. And the UN had the resources to do that when facing the North Korean army. However, when 300,000 battle-hardened Chinese communists come in, it's, as MacArthur said, an entirely new war. Moving to the Middle East, the Six-Day War, 1967. Israelis were brilliant tactically and operationally, but catastrophically bad at the strategic and political levels. They fought that war to get the Gaza Strip, the Golan Heights, the West Bank of in Jerusalem, and the Sinai. Now, maybe you could make an argument that they could control the Gaza Strip, the Golan Heights, although boy, Syria was unhappy about that, and the West Bank. But there is no way that they could ever control the Sinai. There is no way. They never had the resources to do it. And in 1973, the Yom Kippur War, the Egyptians launched that war with the expressed intent of puncturing the aura of invincibility of the Israelis. They didn't want to defeat them. They just wanted to show they could be beaten. And in fact, they absolutely achieved that objective. And Israel realized there was no way that they could ever control the Sinai. So for a long, long time, there was a UN mission over there patrolling the Sinai and securing it for them. In Asia, we'll go one more time and we'll have on a high point over here. The Tet Offensive in 1968 was a spectacular success for the North Vietnamese. Wow. I mean, it was a catastrophic loss for the Viet Cong, who were essentially knocked out of the coalition that they had with the North Vietnamese because they lost essentially all of their fighting forces. But boy, for the North Koreans or the North Vietnamese, it couldn't have been any better. Not only are the VC out, which they were increasingly on the different sides of the political solution out there, but it also turned the U.S. public opinion against the war, relatively increasing their success. So in those 8 examples, just kind of walking through and getting us up to about 50 years prior over here, we can kind of see this Clausewitzian challenge here played out. How do you use destructive power to contribute to the constructive power of it and make that force serve policy? Alexander the Great, fantastic at it. Bismarck, great. The North Vietnamese, excellent at it. 3 of those, good. The other 5, catastrophically bad. So, in summary, the allure of decisive battle and campaigns and a willingness to risk it by fighting short-term wars of unconscionable brutality at the tactical and operational levels have combined to both highlight and exacerbate the Clausewitzian challenge identified by Rose. How do you reconcile war's destructive power with its constructive power to overcome short-term thinking and make force serve politics? I'll end by saying that current U.S. joint doctrine recognizes 6 general groups of military activities that typically occur in preparation for and during large-scale joint operations. These are shape, deter, seize the initiative, dominate, stabilize, and then enable civil authorities. Will this work? Is it appropriate? And is it sufficient to overcome this challenge that we have discussed. Thank you, and I invite your questions, comments, and ideas regarding examples from over the previous years that I did not address and that may confirm or refute this challenge that Gideon Rose has shared with us. Thanks.
Thank you, Dr. Jordan. That was fascinating and yeah, just very interesting. Thank you for your preparation. So yeah, if the participants at the bottom, there's an option to chat. If you want to, or you can raise your hand. If you have a question, you can just type it into chat, and then we can ask Dr. Jordan the questions.
I have a question for Dr. Jordan.
Yes, sir.
Thanks, everybody. It's glad to be here at this meeting. And by the way, I'm also the program director for intelligence studies. So,
well, fantastic. Great to meet you.
So, yeah, so great to hear anything. When you put out bait like that on Clausewitz, I'm pretty much a sucker for it. Hey, but looking at these examples, I think they're very interesting. I tend to think we've done better with this than we're often given credit for. And let me throw a few ideas at you. Maybe you'll disagree, but World War II, we often focus on the Cold War as the result of that. But look at how our main enemies, how we completely turned them politically into we used a constructive force very effectively in turning them all into allies right after the war, and they've stayed allies of ours. I mean, we like, pardon?
Except Soviet Union.
Well, yeah, but of course, that our view of them as an ally was always somewhat pragmatic, right? We almost
concur.
Even when Lend-Lease was going on, we always realized that it was all our giving and their taking, so unfortunately it took a long time for our leadership to process that. But yeah, I mean, there's a lot of times where I think that even I like to, when I do a class on similar to this, and I asked the question, was Iraq in these terms really that big a disaster? We like to think of it that way, but in fact, we've turned it into something resembling a democratic regime in the Middle East, which nobody thought was going to happen. A regime that doesn't have, it isn't trying to pursue nuclear weapons anymore, which was the big security concern for many years in the Middle East. And so even there, sometimes it looks sloppy, but maybe we haven't been as bad at that as some people think.
Sure. No, I would say that, no, I would agree. And that one example I'll use is that within the national security environment, the four instruments of national security, of instruments of national power: diplomatic, information, military, economic. So it's been really the big M and the small DIE, for a long time. But in the last 10 to 15 years, we've actually augmented that with three more elements of statecraft: finance, intelligence, and legal or law enforcement. So we have expanded the instruments of national power, almost doubled them. And I would say I would agree with you in many ways. Since 9/11, certainly, well, let's not use 9/11. Since the end of the Cold War, I think we are becoming better at using the other instruments of national power. We just have to understand how important they are, how important foreign aid is, how important having a robust foreign service is, to go out there and to conduct diplomacy and to do these things. So I think that some of it is, we were, if all you have is a hammer, everything looks like a nail.
Right.
We were a little bit stuck in that, but I think we're getting better at that in terms, at least from a process standpoint, and using, now we have the dime fill, which is more than the dime, I don't think that everybody is going directly to the military as the first instrument of national power. So,
right, that's great. I mean, I think about that. It sounds like we have a better idea of what power actually is than perhaps we had in the past.
well, I think that we're moving from the Morgenthau, the Thucydides, the Hobbesian realist tradition over there that says we get power for the sake of power, even in the realists. Okay, so there are still some realists out there, but neo-realists will tell you that you get power to increase your security. So whereas your standard realist, power was just power to have the sake of power. You wanted it because you have more, and that means somebody else has less.
Right.
Neo-realists now are saying, no. The reason that we have power is to increase our security, number one, and that also then means that there can be a finite amount of power that we need as long as our security is we're comfortable with it. So yeah, absolutely, I would agree.
Thank you.
Oh, sure. Yeah, no, I appreciate the engagement.
Can I start now?
Yes.
All
How
right.
are you?
Hello, Dr. Jordan again. One of the things I did skim over the book recently of that Mr. Gideon Rose has written. One of the things that he does claim to highlight quite a lot is that for these military operations or the wars that has been happening, there does seem to be a lack of an exit strategy that takes place post-war. I think that is important, and you've been talking about how war, how it's coercive, it brings negative effects, and it's destructive force. But I would like to know as to how we can evolve into making it more of a constructive force. Some people propose that there's nation building and things like that, but that falls more for civilian agencies, I believe.
Oh, it does. And it's a great question. I would say that from the military study standpoint, a lot of that has to do with the military's understanding of professionalism, and this is based in Samuel Huntington's, work, seminal work of The Soldier and the State. And The Soldier and the State posits that professionalism should look like this: up to the time that the bullet, that the shooting starts, the diplomats are in charge. Once the shooting starts, get out of the way, and the military takes over. Leave us alone. Let us do what we want to do. And then when the shooting stops, back over to you, and we're out. Now, the only time that really sort of maybe kind of happened was a little bit in World War I. But even then, Wilson sent over Tasker Bliss to sit on the Supreme War Council. It wasn't John J. Pershing on there. Pershing was fighting the war, and the recent retired Chief of Staff, Bliss, was in there doing diplomacy along with Colonel House and all these other people. So the first thing is that we had to get a different mindset in there. And Huntington, he wrote his book in the early 50s, and he was really influential. He's still taught at West Point up there. The Huntington thesis is very, very powerful because it's neat, it's clean. We have these divisions over here between, when war starts, it's us, and when it's done, it's you. And Rose talks about that a little bit. Says we got to get away from that. It has to be much more of a team effort to do that. So we have tried to do some of that in both Afghanistan. I'm thinking specifically of Ambassador Eikenberry over there, and we've tried to do some of that in Iraq. I think the problem that comes up there is that I think everybody realizes this. The military doesn't want to do the post-stability operations, but the security needs remain paramount on there. But one of the things that's really challenging on this is fundamentally different cultures in the Department of Defense and the Department of State. So I think what we need is more interagency working, more ways to develop in there. And from the military standpoint, they definitely have tried to put in their planning, for these kinds of aspects. And so, like I said, in terms of joint, they just added a phase 6 in there that talks about enabling civilian authorities. It's pretty new. I don't want to say this is the silver bullet that's going to fix it all, but it's an official doctrinal recognition, at least, that we got to do something there, and we got to start doing more of that. So I think your question is dead on, and I think Rose does. I think that's one of the strengths of strengths of this book too, is that he really looks at, because he comes at it from a foreign policy perspective, not from a military. So I really appreciate the question. It's a great one.
Okay, thank you.
What about us, though? I mean, you got me thinking about something, because I was, a lot of, when we talk about, U.S., right?
Mm-hmm.
And it seems to me in a lot of these cases, and I'll just throw out a quote. And I love this quote because it's from This Kind of War by T.R.
Fehrenbach.
Yeah, and he talked about the change that had occurred in Korea. This was about the Korean War. And he said, we went from a war of sort of democratic jihad to basically a war of political policy, something like that, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so we talked about, I suggested that I thought we actually did a pretty good job in World War II, reshaping, using constructive power for enemies.
Sure.
But then, when we had a war of national policy in Korea, as Dr. Jordan pointed out, policy was, our goals were all confused. We went from, we're going to unite the peninsula, to all of a sudden we're just hoping that we can save what we can, And it seems to me that we've had our problem has been in the American democracy. If you look at it, like, if we've got the democratic jihad going, we can use that constructive power. But it's tougher when we're doing it with kind of vague or limited policy goals for whatever it will be, peacekeeping or what have you. I don't know.
No, absolutely.
That I often have when I think about these things.
Well, in Rose, one of the points that Rose makes in there too is that the politicians are not at they are as much at fault here too, because when you get a vague goal, then you don't know what it looks like. So in Korea, let's just use example, because Rose uses that too. So the initial policy objective in Korea, when we decided to send troops over there, was to maintain, reestablish, and then maintain a free and independent, non-communist Republic of Korea, which is South Korea. When the Incheon landing happened in September 15th, by the beginning of October, the UN, with the US's prodding, had said, hey, no, let's change this. Now we want to unite the entire Korean peninsula under the democratic rule. And this was going to be of Sigmund Rhee. Well, this was an anathema to North Korea, but there was no way that they were ever going to, not only was not North Korea wasn't going to agree to this, the Chinese communists were never, ever going to agree to this. So that was the goal. And officially, Rose points this out, that it wasn't changed until late 1951. But for all intents and purposes, once the Chinese communists came in after Thanksgiving, November 1950, by December 1950, they had changed, and they had reverted back unofficially to maintain a free and independent non-communist Republic of South Korea. And that was the goal. And then Ridgway comes in, and the fight, Walker dies, Ridgway comes in, the fighting, kind of stabilizes along the 30th parallel. And then things got so bad in November 1951, Chinese communists, that's when they really decided that, okay, this is going to be something. So militarily, the United Nations command over there had used the destructive power of war to bring about set the conditions for political settlement. But then the next 2 years were all about voluntary repatriation of POWs. This was never a well thought out goal. This was never, this was not a die on the hill kind of goal. It was just kind of, oh yeah, no, if they want to come back, they come back, and they don't. This was the sticking point, and it was never, ever something that we thought about in June, July 1950, and yet that's what kept us at the table in Panmunjom for 2 straight years. Yeah, no, so it's a good point. We have to, as careful as our planning has to be militarily, we have to have goals. And so this is the Weinberger doctrine, the Powell doctrine, saying, hey, we have to have these goals. We have to have these finite, these specific, these deliberate, explicit goals. And some people say, well, that's not how the world works. It's a come to war.
You need the triangle, don't you? You need the
right.
you need the triangle, and if you don't have the people either, it's I get this is why I'm sort of sympathetic to Clausewitz's approach, because if you don't have the people, we've seen it. We just can't use the constructive force to get achieve those goals.
Well, and as he says, it's a continuation of politics by other means. What Clausewitz really means, I think the genius of Rose is that what Clausewitz is accused of glorifying battle, and certainly that's how the Germans read him.
Right.
Moltke said that was the book. The British too, absolutely. World War I, no question. But if you really read Clausewitz and you understand what he's saying, I think Rose gets very close to the heart of saying it, that Clausewitz is saying, use battle, be destructive, do what you need to do to set the conditions, but it's all about the political situation. It's all about setting up a stable peace that's sustainable. And if you can't get that, battle's not going to solve anything. It's not going to be there. And I think Sun Tzu would be certainly, he would agree with that. Sun Tzu absolutely agrees, and Clausewitz on the same sheet of music about war being politics by other means. And I think let's throw in the big three, the third strategist over there. Thucydides would absolutely agree with this. Thucydides would say it's complete folly to start a war that you don't know what the outcome is and you don't have the resources to do it. And that, you can read, there's so many great parts about Thucydides, but in the end, that's Thucydides' main critique of the Peloponnesian War is precisely that the Athenians should have known better and could have done better, but they lost this war because they were stupid. And, oh, by the way, the Spartans adapted better.
Right. Hey, I have to go. Thank you for inviting me to this. I'm going to try to get to the next one.
Oh, great. Well, I think the next one will be fantastic. We've got someone from Department of Homeland Security that Jeff has set up, and I'm just kind of the filler meat to get people going in. So great to be with us.
Well, it was a great start. Thank you, everybody. Bye.
All right, thanks.
Take care. I have another question for you, Dr. Jordan.
Yes, sir.
Rose basically said that for ending wars properly, it's best to start with the end state first plan and plan backwards, or in essence, kind of reverse engineer the problem by judging the war's success based on the political outcomes it produces. But I find it a little difficult to see how the strategy is feasible because, well, the political outcomes produced by war can be, well, unpredictable at times. And it sounds strange to me because, well, in shaping grand strategy, political leaders have to always adjust to the changing circumstances. I believe it was one thing I read in, let me see here. The shaping of grand strategy, policy, diplomacy, and war. I'll hold it up for you to see.
Who wrote it?
It is by, hold on, Richard Hart, Senrich.
Oh, yeah.
James
Sure.
Lacey, Williamson Murray.
Right. Yeah. Well, what Rose's point is, and he's absolutely right on this, and Clausewitz would say you're right, that he's right. Sun Tzu would say he's right. Thucydides would say he's right. The point is that you have to have an explicit, deliberate political goal in mind. What you're talking about is shaping grand strategy because there's contingency is what it's called, or opportunity comes up, and oh, we didn't know that we could do this. The Allies in Europe in 1945. The Allies didn't think they were going to win it in 45 necessarily. They really thought it might have to go to 46. The Allies in 1918 had all the plans in the world to win World War I in 1919. 1918 just happened because the Germans fell apart. So there are strategic objectives that you can achieve and you can actually exceed, but the political objective has to remain paramount, and that is, if you change that, and my Korean example is a really good example of that. If you change that, then you risk upsetting the entire balance of the war. We had the resources, we had the political will, we had the international backing to go into South Korea and to reestablish South Korea as a sovereign nation, maintain free and independent country over there. When we decided to unify the Korean Peninsula, we didn't have the resources, and we didn't have near the political support for this. Now all of a sudden people are saying, well, I'm not so sure about that. A more recent example is Desert Storm. People said we should have gone beyond Kuwait. You know, the idea of Desert Storm was to go and reestablish a free and independent, non-Iraq dominated Kuwait. And we did that. And then people said we should have gone on to Baghdad. Are you kidding me? A town of 5 million people that where every one of them would have fought us tooth and nail over there. And we didn't have the political will. Remember, the Syrians fought with the Allied coalition in Desert Storm. People forget that. The Syrians fought with the Allied coalition. So when I was in Desert Storm, I had to actually tell my soldiers to turn their weapon systems away because we had trained forever. When a T-62 tank comes in there, you fire at it. That's what the Syrians had, because they were fighting with us, and yet they were driving right through our area. So Rose's point is that you have to have an explicit political goal, and you got to stick to it. And that if you don't have that, he's not saying, he's not arguing against contingency like you're saying. He's not saying don't take opportunity. You have to understand that political goal is what you have, and that's your resource to it. And that if you're going to, go after contingency, you better have the resources to do it. The Allies did have that in 1918, and they were able to do it. The Allies did have that in Europe in 1945, and they were able to do it. The United Nations Command did not have it in 1950, and they crossed the 30th parallel, and all of a sudden, it was an entirely new war, as MacArthur said. So yeah, your point is well taken when he's talking about that. He's not arguing against contingency. He's arguing for more deliberate nature.
Okay, thank you. I believe we have questions from James Welchoy. He's asking, how do you feel about President Trump's foreign policies go to meet the challenge of ensuring constructive is used along with the destructive aspect of war? This is from James.
Yeah, great question.
To be kind of quick, by the way. We're kind of running out of time, but yeah, we'd love the question. So, yeah, great question. If you read the National Security Strategy, it was actually written by H.R. McMaster, who just has a new book coming out in there to do it, and it is infused with realist policy. Realist policy says that it accepts the fact that nation states are constantly in contact or in competition. It's very Hobbesian. It says, that people are going to do this. So the national security strategy, as it's written right now, is very cogent, and it's kind of an aggressive, it's a muscular policy that says we're going to use force or the threat of force to create the conditions, but it absolutely embraces the constructive notion of war to create a better, increased stability, security, and create a more lasting peace in here. So it's rich in that it talks about the competition, but it's neo-realist in its perspective on power is much more about using it to ensure security and stability than it is to gather it on its own. And that's from how the policy is written. How the policy has been executed is a very different question.
Any other questions from the audience?
I have one question. You're talking about nation states. My question would be, like, for instance, in Iran, where they have state-sponsored terrorism being funneled through the different terrorist cells, and trying to ensure stability for the economy in Iran. I know that, like, some of our foreign policy stuff with this administration, we have to keep updated with the, oh, what was it? I can't remember their plants over there, but basically we're pulling out of this deal because you're funding all of this terrorism through the state. And so you have the state of Iran, but you also have non-state actors. How do we jive with that? How do you deal with that, based on either military or economic sanctions or law enforcement coming in?
Well, that's kind of a question about what's the best use of all the instruments of national power. So I talked about there's diplomacy, there's information, there's military, there's economic, but then there's also now we've added finance, intelligence, and legal and law enforcement. So a lot of what we're talking about there has somewhat to do with our own political goals, but it also has a little bit to do with with alliance goals. And so then you get into there, the feasible, acceptable, suitable test. What is it that you can do that is feasible, that is likely to have some kind of impact? What is acceptable to not only ourselves, within America, within our political environment, but also to our allies? And then what is suitable? What will, what are we willing to contribute, to do this, and to achieve those objectives? And I think that the feasible, acceptable, suitable aspect of crafting a policy for kind of this, state that doesn't operate within the norm, the Westphalian norms, the rule of law kind of norms, has really been a challenge for America and for the West, because we're not willing to do some of the things. It won't pass the acceptability test of the things that we need to do. We've made a major commitment in the area, and yet still there's not the ground level, the groundswell of support that we would want from them there. So I go back to what I said about the Small Wars Manual. A lot of times this is occurring; these wars are occurring when diplomacy has not been exhausted, and or they are unreachable diplomatically. And I would say that from a pragmatic standpoint, they are largely unreachable from diplomacy. So if you take diplomacy off the table, what else do you have? So economic sanctions comes in, military comes in, finance comes in, and then some legal kind of aspects. But what we're finding is just, as I mentioned, at the tactical and operational level, we have an increased lethality down there, but we have a decreased decisiveness. We're finding that in these very complex, these uncertain environments like this, that even the traditional kind of levers that we use don't have the level of decisiveness that we want either. If we put on sanctions, they say, so what? We exclude them from the international community. They say, so what? I mean, look at North Korea. They could care less about this. So you either have to find new levers to pull over there, or you just have to be patient. And that's one thing that the realist approach is not particularly supportive of. So best answer I can give you.
Yeah, I have a question. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah, my name is Natalia. So I'm a student at American Military University, but I'm also kind of an international student because I come from Ukraine. And my question will be related to a gray zone warfare, like hybrid warfare. So you talked about different kind of war, like depending on how much force is applied. For example, as you said, the old wars relied more on the force, so the decisiveness of the battle, and it was like the force had more value. Let's say that the force decided more than a new kind of war. So when we talk about hybrid warfare, so in this situation, it is not very clear who is the aggressor or what is a political and what is his objective in this war. So why do countries namely Russia resort to hybrid warfare when it is not clear who is the actual aggressor or what is the actual objective of this aggression. So maybe
Well,
you have.
it's a great question, and I think hybrid warfare. So it's not a new kind of war. First, by saying the nature of war has remained constant since the time of Thucydides. War is about human interaction, and as long as the human condition remains the same, the nature of war is going to change. However, the character of war has changed dramatically. So hybrid is a type of conduct of war, which is warfare. So it is a new kind of warfare, and what it aims to do is to leverage information, is to leverage social media, is to leverage different kinds of force than we're used to in the 19th and the 20th century over here, where you're exactly right. I'm talking about direct force and direct action and military force. They're trying to do, one of the most intriguing things to me about hybrid warfare is that we're seeing an expansion of the idea of power as a way of influence in there to do it in a way that Morgenthau would never have understood unless it was portrayed to him that way. And then he would say, oh yeah, you're using force of a different kind, not military force. You're using power. You're using force, to obtain power. So the reason that people are using hybrid warfare, mostly, not in the case of Russia, but in the smaller states in there, is primarily because it allows them to offset the conventional overwhelming military power of the US, of China, of Russia. You can get at them at different ways, just like guerrilla warfare, that doesn't stand out there and trade blows with a conventional force. Hybrid warfare says, oh, we're not even going to use guerrillas. We're going to use information. We're going to use cyber capabilities. We're going to use social media. We're going to use different kinds of influence over there. All is potent, all is powerful, and all that can be wielded as a type of force. So it's a new way of trying to achieve some level of power, some level of influence, to exert your will over an opponent. It just happens to be not with guns and bullets and bombs necessarily, but with other types of force that are no less impactful. They may not be as lethal, but they're no less impactful.
Thank you so much.
Sure, sure.